Welcome to A Guide to Art, Activism, and Culture. I'm your host, Zoe Elena Moldenhauer. This podcast is brought to you by the Aragram Center for Arts and Culture, where we delve into social issues seen in museums and in art collections today. Joining me is the Whitney Museum of American Art's DeMartini family curator, Marcela Guerrero. Marcela received her PhD in art history and visual culture from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has worked on notable exhibitions including Martin Gutierrez, Supremacy, Vida Americana, Mexican Muralists Remake American Art 1925 to 1945, and Pachayacta Wasichay, Indigenous Space, Modern Architecture, New Art at the Whitney Museum of American Art. From 2014 to 2017, she worked as a curatorial fellow at the Hammer Museum on Radical Women, Latin American Art 1960 to 1985, organized by the Getty Foundation's Pacific Standard Time LA initiative. Welcome, Marcela. It's a pleasure speaking with you today. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Marcela Guerrero. I am the DeMartini family curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art.
And today we will be discussing an exhibition you curated, No Existe, Mundo, poshuracán, Puerto Rican Art in the Wake of Hurricane Maria, that recently ended at the Whitney Museum of American Art on April 23, 2023. Can you introduce the exhibition and why you wanted to tell this story in the way that you did?
Yes, so this is an exhibition that opened the year of the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Maria. The hurricane happened on September 20th, 2017. It was a Category 5 hurricane that the minute it touched land, it got downgraded to Category 4, although in some parts of the island, the winds were felt at a Category 5 scale. And it was a moment that everyone knew that it was going to really mark the history of Puerto Rico. I was in Brooklyn. I had just given birth to my daughter. I was with my mom, who typically lives in Puerto Rico, but she was here helping me. My dad had been here, but he went back. And so, as it happened with many people, we couldn't get in touch with him for a couple of days. That separation that one felt of that, the experience of what people were living there, and also this other kind of different trauma felt by the diaspora of not being able to be in touch with their loved ones and family, and knowing that in the recent past, Puerto Rico had announced a massive debt. There were already blackouts, there were already, closing of schools, so many things that became more exacerbated after the hurricane. But thinking about why all of these overlapping disasters keep happening, it's kind of this the colonial weight expressed in the most perverse of ways. And I knew, when the hurricane happened, that Puerto Rican artists have always sought to analyze its colonial condition and imagine ways to think and process this moment. And so that was kind of the gist of the idea.
The exhibition, as well as the events of Hurricane Maria, are so personal and is present in many people's lived experience. How did you consult with everyday Puerto Ricans in the planning process of this exhibition? Or what resources did you draw on to get a sense of what people wanted to know or have presented?
First and foremost, that the lived experience of a Puerto Rican also included people on the island, people in the diaspora, that those were different experiences, but both were very valid. I was implicated, obviously, not just as a curator, not in that authorial way, but as someone who has very strong feelings and attachment to Puerto Rico. Your question made me reflect a lot on this, of the conversations that I had with the artist. And it was at that level, like, you are not only the artist whose work I want to borrow for the show, but you were also someone who experienced this. And we're also the typical Puerto Rican that I consider them as a visitor level and as a viewer. And so we had many conversations about the thesis of the show, how it was going to be represented, who else was going to be part of those stories. In 2019, a group of 10 scholars or thinkers or curators, all happened to be women, and they came for a workshop or a day and a half, 2 days of conversations, closed doors with me. And that included people like Marina Reyes Franco from the Museum of Contemporary Puerto Rico, Natalia Viera Salgado, a young emerging curator, very involved in the local scene and emerging artist scene. Susana Torre de Leva, kind of the other end of someone who's been working with Puerto Rican artists for decades. So it was 10 people, all with different levels of adjacency to the art. And many of the ideas ended up in the exhibition in a way. My process of this exhibition was already embedded in my own life. Going to Puerto Rico was something that I was doing once or twice a year because I have family there. And I have friends and all of that. That kind of rhythm was already part of my life, and so it was easy to translate it into the process of the show.
The exhibition is celebrated as being one of the first major retrospectives of contemporary Puerto Rican art in a major New York City museum. What makes contemporary Puerto Rican art distinctive, and how did you go about selecting the artists for the exhibition?
I think it was important to mention it was a groundbreaking exhibition, the one that happened in 73, 74 at the Metropolitan Museum and with El Museo del Barrio. And obviously, understanding well that there had been many exhibitions of Puerto Rican art in Puerto Rico, and in other museums in the US. The Met Museum from the 70s covered everything from Taino art to the present. And it had a very kind of pedagogical element, being that El Museo was involved, a former school. So it had great merits based on those points. For the Whitney, the differentiation would be that it was a very, very specific small window that we wanted to look at and unpack by using the hurricane as a lens. We can think of this overlap of climate change and something that will continue to occur, and colonization. That is not unique to Puerto Rico, but it is a condition of Puerto Rico. But what became very beautiful from comments that I heard from people on how much they could see their own countries reflected, I was glad to get those comments because it's a very specific exhibition, obviously, but it has echoes in many other contexts. The process for the show happened in ways that might be surprising. I had seen the work of some of the artists, like Edra Soto, but I had never met her, meaning they weren't necessarily artists who were friends or in my network. The workshop that we did in 2019 that also helped really by doing research and following galleries in Puerto Rico that I go to often and seeing like, oh, okay, this person might fit. It's also art, I think, that's different from what you see in Chelsea and blue chip galleries. You don't necessarily know all of the artists, and you do research and you might have an idea or a concept. And so that helps define which kind of artist you're going to visit or you're going to reach out to do a studio visit. But those were many, obviously more than the 20 that I invited. It was a very large pool of artists. Then, as I was refining the idea, I was refining the selection.
Museums are about exhibitions, but the hidden part is what goes on behind the scenes of choosing to present an idea for an exhibition, what controversies a museum chooses to embrace, and what controversies to avoid. Can you take us through that process at the Whitney that led to this exhibit and the form it took?
I came back from parental leave, and I think it was within that year we pitched exhibitions, which is not typical. Getting an exhibition on the calendar can take many forms. That year, it happened to be this way that the chief curator asked us to pitch a couple of exhibitions. Everyone could pitch up to two ideas. And so one of the ideas that I pitched, it was a very brief, like 5 minutes, very raw kind of version of this exhibition. I think it was the next meeting, and people could comment on other people's exhibitions to get feedback and say which ones kind of came to the surface. And many of my colleagues said, this is an exhibition that the Whitney should do. This is something that we really should host here, and Marcela should organize it, blah, blah. And that was pretty much the way it got greenlit. After that, we typically present to upper management committee, and then it got on the calendar. If there was anything, there are certain moments of like, okay, so what kind of language are we going to use? And why are we using certain language? Are we using colonial? Yes, we need to use the word colony. That's very important. The show is going to be where this exhibition Josh Klein is right now. So on the fifth floor, like that side. So a much smaller footprint because of the pandemic. A lot of things also got moved and extended, and we had to shift a lot of things around. So that kind of benefited the exhibition in a way. I feel bad saying that, but we had more time, which helped for the catalog and get a catalog. And also the chief curator said, "Oh, okay, well, let's try this new thing, which we've never done in the past in this building." Which was to do the exhibition on the sixth floor, because the sixth floor is typically a permanent collection floor. And so he gave me the entire sixth floor, and that was like, okay, great. So now I need to rethink the thesis so that it can incorporate more artists and all of that. So those behind the scenes things that happened ended up benefiting the show, actually.
You mentioned what kind of language you wanted to use for the exhibition. There were several stages of experience between the art and the explanation where the viewers were given a specific interpretation that wasn't necessarily apparent in the artwork. What parameters did you set in writing the wall labels?
Usually the way I write wall labels is information drawn from my studio visits with the artist and inside knowledge of what they think the work is about. Also, if there's anything published about a work, and those are ideas that I think might be important to, I put it in my own words, I rewrite them. Yeah, labels are tricky because every museum has its own way of thinking about labels. We don't describe what people are seeing, though it's more about an interpretation and analysis of the work without overdoing it. So I'm thinking of the label for Gamaliel Rodríguez, Collapse Soul. Have been reflecting a lot on ships, and so I added a little bit of that interpretation of how it can go back to 1898 and that ship that exploded outside of Cuba and led to what is sometimes referred to as the Spanish-American War. That's not something that Gama was thinking when he did the painting, but I think I added it, and a mention of the Jones Act to kind of how ships have been so important in the imaginary of Puerto Ricans for so long. So we have a whole department that's working. I write them and then they give me feedback. And then we show the labels to the artist to make sure that they agree with what is being said and that it's factually correct and all that. So that's an important process. I think, yeah, the labels had an ideology, if we may call it that. And I think that is also derived from the artist, someone like Guillo Tirado, who his position and that of his work are completely against the privatization of beaches. And there's a very clear point of view. That's definitely true. I think I was either agreeing with that point of view and also representing that point of view from the artist. So not putting anything that the artist wouldn't agree with.
How do you see art contributing to the plight of Puerto Rico?
That's a really great question about. I was actually just reading a quote by Colleen Smith, not related to the show at all, but she said, I actually believe that art can contribute more, and I'm paraphrasing her here, can contribute more than politicians even can, because we've tried that and we know where that has led us. And so this real belief in that when you go to a museum, this is my thinking now, not Colleen's. When you go to a museum, you go in knowing that you're gonna see works of art and that you're gonna derive a message and something. You're gonna learn something from a work of art. If you're coming to the museum, is because you're ready for that. You know, you're ready to do the exercise of looking hard at an artwork and wanting that artwork to tell you something that you can't find anywhere else. I also think that when it comes to Puerto Rico, because there is so much heavy history and laws and like facts, that we've also tried that and should continue to exist in the form of history courses, in the way of journalism. But let's try this other method. Let's try to look at art and see what we can learn from that, what we can gain, what new knowledge, what new discourse we can learn from looking at a work of art that you can't find it anywhere else. If you see Gamaliel's boat, and you don't read the label, you don't have to. But even knowing that you're in the context of an exhibition about Puerto Rico, you're going to feel something. This is not a beautiful, rosy story that the painting is telling you. It's quite harsh, right? So I think that it can happen at many levels to many different people.
Right, that there are many forms of activism, and art can pick up where the written word can no longer continue. So the exhibition was extremely successful and received rave reviews. What do you think excited people the most? Was it the fact that Puerto Rican artists were given the recognition in a major institution? Do you think that success will rub off on Puerto Rican-based art organizations like El Museo de Barrio or the Clemente that don't have the cachet of the Whitney?
Yeah, I think people were excited and surprised to see a show like this in this museum, that's for sure. We have to say it, their surprise says a lot of what people think of the Whitney. And so we have to be honest about that. Even people who are in the arts told me, oh, there were so many names of artists that I didn't know. So that element of surprise at many levels, from seeing Puerto Rico in a museum like the Whitney to who is this artist that I didn't know. It wasn't lost on people how much considerable real estate was given for this show. That every artist also, because of that, they weren't crammed into the wall next to the stairs or next to the bathroom. Yeah, I don't know if Museo del Barrio or smaller institutions, if they want the reviews and everything, the attention to rub off on them. I don't know if that's how they would characterize it. The Clemente gave one of the artists a residency, or two of the artists that could have been probably in the plans from before the exhibition. I don't know. But many created programming that overlapped with the show. So that was really nice to see. Your question made me think about was in the recent Bronx Museum Gala, there were many artists who were part of the auction. And one, Gamaliel, that I've mentioned before, there were, I think, 18 bids for his painting, which is, I don't think it's typical. There is attention, and that is going in many different directions. And I don't know if rub off is the right phrase, but will have an impact on other museums. We're all here to learn from each other. I've also been thinking about this recently and how the more of us that are in the field working means that there's a little bit of competition, and I say that for lack of a better word because it's very collegial, obviously, but it means that it's like, oh, and Muso's gonna do a show about this, like, oh man, damn. Don't we want to be redundant? There are more spaces for artists to show, and we're all like really interested in wanting to get to that artist first and things like that. The way I see it, more about the network of museums and connections and spaces that will show more of the artists that were in the show or other artists that perhaps in the future will have a relationship with the Whitney, that type of thing.
You mentioned programming. How will the museum maintain the momentum of the exhibition's message in an ethical and meaningful way without fading away over time?
Yeah, your question made me think of the recent show that we have now that opened, and it overlapped with No Existe by a week, of Jean Quick to C. Smith, and how beautiful it was that those two kind of followed each other. And I don't know if, honestly, if those exhibitions would have been possible 10 years ago for different reasons. But I think that that's a meaningful way of continuing the conversation, of saying how there was this exhibition about a very specific colonial context. And then we have an exhibition of a Native American woman artist that is also, in a way, talking about colonization, extractive policies and laws and uses of the land. And even Josh Klein, in his own way, dealing with ideas about the climate catastrophe that's going to happen. Because sometimes I get this question asked, and I don't know if it's my fault. I maybe I take it too literal if they do ask if there's going to be another exhibition about Puerto Rican art. Sure, there should be more in other institutions and by other curators, and we want to hear other perspectives. But we also need to keep thinking and moving. And that for me is a question of like how meaningful the program can continue to be and not go back to things that might be at odds with these ideas. That I would find really problematic. Things that might, in a way, I don't know, celebrate the patriotism of America. That would be super weird. That would be the opposite of what, of what a meaningful progress means. On the other hand, there's also the work that the Department of Education does in creating long lasting partnerships. And that's really the role, right? Connections that extend beyond the exhibition. And so we have partners like Lisaida Center, the Casita Maria. We had a partnership for the exhibition with El Centro that we're now thinking like in which other ways we can continue that, right? One way that I guess I'm excited also to see in the future of the Museum of the Whitney is because we're acquiring many works from the exhibition into the collection. Always the wish and the desire is to have them live and imagine many, many, many contexts in which a painting, a work, a sculpture can be in exhibitions at the Whitney with other works from our collection. But it's when it's next to this other work by a non-Puerto Rican artist, what other conversations that might bring. Art can be very flexible in that way, that it always will retain its original context and ideas, but then it can spark other conversations. So I'm excited to see that in the future of the Whitney.
That's exciting to hear that people will encounter the artwork outside of the exhibition's context and have those same experiences. Do you have any final thoughts or announcements you would like to make?
Thank you for your questions because I'm reflecting now a lot on the future of the show. Luckily, we created a lot of content that will live on the website. We translated the catalog into Spanish with the intention of teachers from New York and teachers from Puerto Rico can teach the exhibition and also make use of the catalog that's completely downloadable for free on the website without having, that barrier of the $40 whatever coffee table book that these catalogs have. So we'll see, because I just closed the exhibition. I'm at this point of like, okay, so what afterlife will this have? I'll watch from my little apartment in Brooklyn how this will develop.
This has been A Guide to Art, Activism, and Culture, a podcast from the Aragram Center for Arts and Culture. I've been your host, Zoe Elena Moldenhauer. Join us on our next episode, and in the meantime, visit our website at www.aragram.org or follow us on social media, events, and more for artists and writers.